Imagine you are out in the densely snow-covered woods of southern Finland in 1939. You're armed with a Mosin Nagant sniper rifle and you're out in the snow all day scanning for targets. There's a certain individual you're tasked with finding, but you come up with nothing. Before you know it, it's time to head back to camp. You go to gather your things until suddenly a shot rings out. But it doesn't come from you. In fact, you never even heard it. My friend, you've just been shot by the greatest sniper in history, the White Death. Today we're going to talk about the life, story, and legacy of Simo Hayha, or the White Death as we remember him. A man who was essential not only for beating back the Soviets during what we know as the Winter War, but a man who was also essential for the morale and spirit during that war for the Finnish army. Simo Hayha was born in southern Finland to a farming family on December 17th, 1905. His home was the Mattila farm owned by his parents Juno and Katrina. The farm had a single house but had around 80 acres of land. Besides attending school and helping on the family farm to grow food, Simo would go out hunting to help put food on the family table for himself, his parents, and his 7 other siblings. Growing up, he would become very skilled at not only shooting in the woods, but also skiing, 2 skills that would become a deadly combination in the future. As a kid, Simo would bear witness to his country breaking away from Russia when the Russian monarchy fell, and Finland would devolve into a civil war between the communist Reds, supported by the Russian communists, and the non-communist White faction, supported by Germany. This civil war would last 3 months, from January 27th to May 15th, 1918. Simo's upbringing not only conditioned him to be superior in his skill, but also superior in his mentality, by embracing the Finnish concept of sisu, which is a concept of facing adversity and challenge no matter the difficulty or the cost. This concept isn't exclusive to Finland, but it's very much a part of Finnish culture. Not only did Simo grow up hunting, but he would join the Finnish Civil Guard, or the Suojeluskunta, at age 17. While he was in the Civil Guard, he would take part in certain shooting competitions. In one particular competition, the participants had to score as many shots as they could out of 100 on a target that sat 300 meters away from their position, and they could only achieve this using the standard iron sights on their issued rifles. Simo scored a very impressive feat of 93 shots out of 100 using his iron sights. Now, one distinction I want to make is that Simo is not in the full front Finnish army yet. The Suojeluskunta acts as a reserve army force, so maybe they don't receive as much training, or they don't get as much funding or weapons to be armed with. However, in 1925, Simo would serve a mandatory 15 months military service at age 19, which all men are required to do when they come of age. During his 15 months, he would serve in multiple bicycle battalions, and yes, the idea that a grown man riding a bicycle into battle with a gun on his back is very funny to me, but things were just different 100 years ago. Simo would serve his mandatory 15 months of military service and then maintain his position in the Civil Guard while also maintaining his farm, hunting, and competing in more shooting competitions. And he would live this way for the next 10 years of his life, right up until things changed. In 1939, Russia would invade Finland to conquer some territory that bordered their regions. Stalin in particular wanted to push the Finnish-Russian border back to secure the city of Leningrad, which sat very close to the Finnish-Russian border. Stalin feared that the city would fall in the event that Finland would side with Germany in a joint war against Russia. Now, to their credit, Russia did negotiate with Finland to maybe cede this territory over to them without bloodshed, but Russia's demands were promptly rejected. Now, the problem with invading Finland to get this territory is that they had a non-aggression pact with them, and if Stalin broke that non-aggression pact on the world stage, he would look very bad, and the whole world would promptly back up Finland and be against him. To justify this invasion to the rest of the world, Russia would stage a false flag event that we would come to know as the shelling of Manila. On November 26th of 1939, Russia positioned some artillery near their town of Manila and launched artillery at it, or at least near it outside of its outskirts, and blamed Finland for this attack. Finland, knowing that they didn't do this attack, denied any involvement, but agreed to cooperate with any third-party investigation that would like to come and investigate what really happened. Russia rejects this notion and invades Finland 4 days later, sending 450,000 troops into southern Finland. So with this setup, it might look like that Finland is going to be crushed immediately under the might of the Soviet hammer. However, there are some factors that would help Finland over the course of this war. So the first factor is that Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, had committed what we know as the Great Purge, which is when the Soviet secret police eliminated political enemies that could be a threat or that he feared could be a threat to challenge his rule. This included people in the government and experienced army officers in the Red Army, which left the Red Army grossly incompetent and missing that valuable experience that they once had. Factor number 2 I want to point out is that Finland knew their land and they knew it well, whereas Russia hadn't had this land for some time and they didn't know it as well as the Finns did. So they would bring heavy or light tanks and they would get stuck in the snow, whereas the Finns would be traversing with skis. Plus, the Finns already had defenses like bunkers set up on the Finnish-Russian border, anticipating that Russia would do this. The third factor is that the Finns had a superior mentality to what the Russians had. The Finns were thinking, this is our homeland and we are being invaded. We are going to make them fight and die for every inch that they take. And compare this with the Russian mindset of, you will die for your country and you will like it. And if you've ever heard people saying that it was stupid for Germany to try to invade Russia during the winter, just know that the Russians did it first to the Finns and they had similar mistakes made. Like not wearing winter camouflage, but just wearing brown Soviet coats, or even just having warm winter clothes. In World War II, we very much know the Russians to have very warm insulated clothing, but in the 1939 to 1940 Winter War, it was a different story. They didn't have insulated coats like they did in World War II. So I don't want anybody to say that the Russians were so good in the winter because they had to learn that from the Finns. The day that the Soviets invaded, Simo was actually doing a training exercise with the Civil Guard and didn't leave to fight until the next day. Simo reported to Arne Juutalainen, a Finnish army lieutenant that had a little nickname of his own called the Terror of Morocco. But if you don't want to call him that, you can always call him Papa like his men did. So let's take a look at what Simo would have been armed with and using for his gear. So right here is a similar rifle to what Simo Hayha would have been using. This is a Mosin-Nagant Soviet-made M91-30. This is what they would have been using in the Winter War and a little bit onwards. Simo was using a different rifle, but as similar to this as the Finns could get. The model that Simo would have been using would have been the M28/30. It was a Finnish-made rifle, but it was similar in origin to the Soviet one. However, it had improved sights. Unlike this one, it stood, well, without this loop here, it stood a little bit higher than what the Soviets had, and it had different markings on the range adjustment. But this is pretty much what Simo would have been using, and he was the greatest sniper in history for a reason. He didn't even have a scope on his rifle, just like how this one doesn't. So, yeah, back to the studio. In addition to Simo's M28 Mosin, he was also using a Suomi KP-31 submachine gun. And it's actually with this submachine gun that he would get a lot of his kills. The M28 rifle that Simo was using was the same one that he was issued in the Civil Guard just 10 years ago. So he had the benefit of knowing how the gun is, how the sights are, caring for it, knowing it inside and out, and he even manufactured ammo for it when there was budgetary restrictions for the Civil Guard. Not that he needed it, but Simo also did have the benefit of having standard issue Finnish army sniper training. So once Simo reported for duty, he was tasked with finding a Russian sniper that had already killed 3 of Juutalainen's platoon leaders. So Simo sets out to go find this sniper, and it's really here where we start to understand what made Simo such a good sniper. So in the morning, just before sunrise, Simo set out to the location where he suspected the Russians might be. Once he picked a spot out in the terrain, he would then build a small snow wall to conceal himself. Once he got the snow wall built, he poured some water down onto it to freeze it over so that it wouldn't kick up any snow when he fired his rifle, revealing his position to the enemy. And once Simo had his dugout ready, he just laid in it all day for hours, and he had concealment down to a T. Now, there's multiple reasons why Simo didn't use a scope. For one, he believed that it would raise his head a couple inches if he used a scope, making him a bigger target. The sniper scope might fog up if he's out in the snow all day during the hours of the day. And if the sunlight was facing a certain direction, the sniper scope glass could glint the light towards the enemy, revealing his position to the enemy, making him a dead giveaway. Without the scope, he could hug his head down onto the rifle, making him as small of a target as humanly possible. And that is essentially key to his whole strategy, eliminating every factor that could play against him. Another way he did this was putting snow and ice into his mouth so that his breath wouldn't fog up the air, revealing himself again. So once Simo has his concealment down, he is just out in the snow all day looking for the sniper. After laying out in that dugout all day long, the sun finally starts to go down. And once it does, Simo sees a glint in the distance. Simo sees the enemy sniper's scope. The sniper is given away from the glare on his sniper scope, but Simo is patient. He doesn't take the shot yet. He is patient enough to wait and find a good, opportune moment to where he's going to have the most chance of success. Right now, the Russian is kind of concealed, but he still sees him. But maybe it's not the best shot to take right now. So Simo waits more. And then the Russian sniper does something very foolish. Once the sun is almost gone and the stars start to come out, the Russian sniper that Simo has been watching stands up in the middle of the open, and Simo decides that this is his shot. One bullet is all it took, and that Russian sniper that has been terrorizing Utalainen's men for a week has been downed in 18 hours. After that day, Simo became the go-to sniper for Arne Utalainen, and he would wreak havoc and build himself a reputation. Whenever Simo wasn't on the front line or in an isolated location playing defense, he would take a squad of guys armed with submachine guns and skis to go find Russian encampments. And this wasn't even a hard thing for them to do, because the Russians would be out in the middle of the night making huge bonfires and drinking themselves silly. Once Simo's group found a camp, they would dismount their skis and slowly crawl up towards the camp until they were close enough to be able to have a conversation with them. But instead of that, they would just spring up from cover and unload their ammo from their submachine guns into the unsuspecting Russians. Now, while I would say it's terrifying to see white-cloaked men spring up from behind a bush ready to kill you with a submachine gun, the chances are that they'd never even got the time to react anyway. On February 17th of 1940, Simo would be awarded with and presented with a ceremonial honorary rifle, which was an M28 just like his, but it had his name on it. This rifle was donated by a Swedish businessman named Eugene Johansson. Also, if you want to know more about the ins and outs of the differences between Simo's rifle and other rifles, I'm going to link in the description down a video from Forgotten Weapons that goes very in-depth about the particular rifle model that Simo had. Simo became such a problem for the Russians that they would try to avoid the area he was in, or would try to bombard it with artillery. They did this because if it meant just a chance at killing the White Death, they were going to take it. On a quick note, it's said that the Russians gave Simo the name the White Death. However, I've seen historians challenge this by saying that it first showed up in Finnish propaganda, but most of us say that it came from the Russian side. But whether the Finnish came up with that name or the Russians did, everyone then and everyone now would come to know Simo by that name, even Comrade Joseph Stalin himself. Stalin, knowing about Simo, would have definitely added some pressure on the Red Army to try and find and kill him. And with that added pressure, the Red Army would become more ferocious in their attempts to try to kill him, whether it's launching entire artillery bombardments to try to kill him, or sending out counter-sniper groups, and even then those failed. At the beginning of March 1940, the Russians launched a major offensive towards the Finns' position where Simo was also operating. They were holding out to the best of their ability, but the Russians kept coming like a tidal wave. There just seemed like an endless number of Russians coming at them all at once. It was getting really bad to a point where Simo started to believe stories that he heard about Russian soldiers being marched into battle at gunpoint from their own machine guns on their tanks. And if they tried to retreat or turn around and go back, they would be gunned down by their own machine guns. Which, if you know anything about the Soviet Union, you know it's not out of character for them to do that sort of thing. During that day, Simo scored his highest number of kills of 40 men in one day. Simo had a great run in this war, and he racked up a lot of kills, but His luck ran out on March 6th of 1940. On that day, Simo was doing his normal due diligence until a shot rang out. But Simo didn't fire. He didn't see anybody. However, he did start to feel bone fragments and blood start to fill up the side of his mouth until he was on the ground and losing consciousness. What Simo didn't know at that time was that he just got shot with an exploding bullet, which is categorically a war crime spanning back since before 1900. But it took a war crime and an exploding bullet to finally tag Simo and get him out of the fight. Now, a little tangent here. I know that war crimes are bad and everything, but it's kind of funny to me to categorize crimes of war when war is the crime. I know, beta take, I know. Simo was presumed dead when his fellow soldiers had found him, and he was taken to a field hospital triage, and it was there that he was thrown onto a pile of dead bodies. He was actually buried among some of the bodies, and he was there for quite some time, until somebody saw him move. Somebody saw Simo moving, and they quickly dug him out of the pile. He was then found to be alive, and then was rushed to go be treated for his injury. Simo woke up 7 days later after going through some surgery to stitch up his wound, and even after this day, he would go on to have several more surgeries to correct and construct his face. Not only was Simo alive, but Russia and Finland had signed a White Peace Agreement ending the Winter War. Finland gave up the land that Russia wanted to Russia, which meant now that Simo's family farm was in Russian territory. However, this didn't matter too much because Simo would be given a new farm by the Finnish government. Despite Finland and Russia having peace now, the peace wouldn't stay, and Finland would join Germany against Russia in World War II, and they would call this the Continuation War. Simo, after a couple years, would go to enlist to help fight in the Continuation War, but he was rejected due to his medical injuries. But I would bet any money that if Simo was allowed to join the Continuation, he would have racked up so many more dead Russians and maybe give them a run for their money. Maybe it might look like the Russian might lose. I don't know, just saying. By the end of Simo's service, he was a second lieutenant in the army and had earned several awards. He had earned the first and second class Medals of Liberty and the third and fourth class Crosses of Liberty. He would also receive the Kola Fighters Medal and would be recommended to gain a new honor, the Mannerheim Cross, which is the Finnish equivalent to the American Medal of Honor. Simo would never gain the Mannerheim Cross because it was created after his service, and some administrative people didn't believe it made sense to award him an award that took place after his service. I like to believe that he had every right to have that medal as much as anybody else. Simo lived a quiet farmer's life up until his old age, and it got to a point where he couldn't do it anymore. So he gave his farm up for rent and would go to stay in an apartment and would die on April 1st, 2002 at age 96. The final shot that Simo had ever taken against the Soviet Union was outliving the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union fell in 1991 and Simo died in 2002. You love to see irony like that. That is very cool. During an interview that Simo gave in his later life, he was asked by the interviewer if he ever regretted killing or doing anything that he did in the Winter War. And Simo answered with this quote, "I did as I was told as well as I could. There would be no Finland if everyone else didn't do the same." In 2017, after his death, his nephew would go on to discover his hidden memoirs that he had written just to keep as records for himself. And in that memoir, Simo's nephew finds a page that's captioned with, "This is my sin list." In that sin list, Simo states that he killed approximately around 500 men. He kept this record, but he never glorified the things that he did, or he never glorified killing. He just went about it with the attitude of, I did what I did for my country, and there would be no Finland without what he did and what everyone else did, which is what keeps him so humble. And it's really something that a humble man that's 5'3", that's a peaceful farmer, can do and achieve what he did and what he achieved. And I heavily encourage you, if not sharing this video, sharing another video on Simo, just to help others that don't know his story learn about his story. This is a remarkable story, and I encourage you to show somebody this video or somebody else's video on Simo, maybe a better one. Just the great story that this is. Simo is a very legendary and very deserving character to be talked about, and his story lives on with every video and every telling of his story. And he is very much deserving of being called the greatest sniper in history. And with that comes the end of today's video. I hope you enjoyed. Goodbye for now.